Welcome to One Book, One Coffee, where we dive deep into books that change how we see the world. I'm genuinely excited you're here today, choosing to spend time with Why Buddhism Is True by Robert Wright. The fact that you clicked on this video tells me something important about you. You're not content with surface-level answers. While others are scrolling through endless feeds or consuming quick dopamine hits, you've chosen to invest your time in something that might actually transform how you understand your own mind. That takes courage, and it sets you apart. Robert Wright's Why Buddhism Is True isn't your typical self-help book or religious treatise. It's a rigorous examination of Buddhist psychology through the lens of evolutionary psychology and modern neuroscience. Wright, a journalist and scholar who's written for Time, The New Yorker, and The Atlantic, didn't approach Buddhism as a believer seeking validation. He came as a skeptic armed with scientific training, struggling with his own meditation practice and wondering if there was any empirical basis for Buddhism's claims about the nature of suffering and enlightenment. What he discovered was that modern psychology and neuroscience are catching up to insights that Buddhist monks figured out 2,500 years ago. Insights about why our minds make us miserable and what we can do about it. Now a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. A science journalist's rigorous investigation into whether Buddhist psychology holds up under scientific scrutiny, and discovers that 2,500-year-old insights about suffering and enlightenment are being validated by cutting-edge neuroscience and evolutionary psychology. Robert Wright approached Buddhism not as a spiritual seeker, but as a skeptical journalist and evolutionary psychologist. Struggling with his own meditation practice, and armed with scientific training from Princeton and his work at major publications, he set out to determine whether Buddhism's core claims could withstand empirical scrutiny. Picture this. You're scrolling through social media at midnight, telling yourself you'll stop after just one more post, but somehow an hour passes and you're still there, feeling worse than when you started. Or maybe you're standing in line at your favorite coffee shop, already thinking about the next thing you need to do instead of simply enjoying the anticipation of that perfect latte. Sound familiar? Well, according to Robert Wright in Why Buddhism Is True, this isn't a character flaw or a sign that you lack willpower. It's actually your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, and that design might be the very thing that's making you miserable. Wright opens this section with a fascinating comparison to the famous red pill scene from The Matrix. You know, the one where Morpheus offers Neo the choice between blissful ignorance and the sometimes harsh reality of truth. Wright suggests that Buddhism offers us a similar choice, but instead of revealing that we're living in a computer simulation, it reveals something equally startling about the nature of our own minds. The uncomfortable truth is that our brains, shaped by millions of years of evolution, are essentially designed to keep us perpetually dissatisfied. Now think about this for a moment. Evolution didn't care about your happiness. It cared about your survival and reproduction. So it equipped you with a brain that's constantly scanning for threats, always wanting more, never quite satisfied with what you have. Wright explains this through what psychologists call the hedonic treadmill. You get that promotion you've been wanting, buy that car you've been dreaming about, or finally move into your ideal apartment, and for a brief moment you feel great. But then, almost inevitably, you return to your baseline level of happiness and start wanting the next thing. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. Our ancestors who were content and satisfied were probably eaten by predators or outcompeted by those who were always striving for more food, better shelter, higher status. The anxious, never quite satisfied humans were the ones who survived long enough to pass on their genes. Congratulations, you've inherited their restless minds. Wright illustrates this with a story that many of us can relate to. He describes checking his email compulsively, even when he knows there's probably nothing important waiting for him. That little ping of anticipation, that microhit of excitement when he sees a new message, followed almost immediately by disappointment when it's just another newsletter or spam. But does this stop him from checking again 20 minutes later? Of course not. His brain has been hijacked by what psychologists call variable ratio reinforcement, the same mechanism that keeps people pulling slot machine levers in Las Vegas. The Buddha, sitting under that Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago, didn't know about neuroscience or evolutionary psychology, but he figured out something remarkably similar. He observed that the root of human suffering isn't external circumstances, it's our constant craving, our endless wanting. We suffer when we don't get what we want, and we suffer when we do get what we want because it doesn't provide the lasting satisfaction we expected. But here's where it gets really interesting. Wright doesn't just leave us with this rather depressing diagnosis. He explains how Buddhist meditation practices offer a way to step off this treadmill. When you meditate, you start to observe your thoughts and feelings with a kind of detached awareness. You begin to see that craving for what it really is, just another mental phenomenon arising and passing away, not something you have to automatically act on. Think of it like this. Imagine you're sitting by a river watching leaves float by. Normally, you might jump into the river and chase after every leaf, getting swept away by the current. But meditation teaches you to sit on the bank and simply watch. You see the leaves, you might even feel the urge to chase them, but you don't have to. You can choose to stay put. Wright shares his own experience with this, describing how meditation helped him recognize the difference between feeling an emotion and being controlled by that emotion. He talks about experiencing road rage during his commute and then, through mindful awareness, watching that anger arise, peak, and naturally subside without him having to act on it or feed it with angry thoughts. This is the red pill moment that Buddhism offers. Once you see how your mind works, how these patterns of craving and aversion operate, you can't unsee it. You realize that so much of what you thought was you is actually just the product of evolutionary programming that you don't have to blindly follow. The beautiful thing about this ancient wisdom is how perfectly it applies to our modern predicament. Whether it's social media addiction, consumer culture, or the constant pressure to achieve more, Buddhism offers tools that are surprisingly relevant for navigating 21st century life. As we'll explore in the coming sections, these insights aren't just philosophical curiosities. They're practical strategies for finding genuine contentment in a world designed to keep us wanting more. Picture this. You're settling into your meditation cushion, ready to embrace the simplicity of just sitting still. How hard could it be, right? I mean, we're talking about literally doing nothing. No emails to answer, no deadlines to meet, no complex problems to solve. Just sit there and breathe. Yet within minutes, you might find yourself in the middle of what feels like an epic internal battle, wondering why something so fundamentally simple has become the most challenging thing you've attempted all week. This is one of the most beautiful paradoxes that Robert Wright explores in his journey through Buddhist practice, and it's something that catches almost everyone off guard. We live in a culture that equates effort with movement, productivity with action, and success with doing more. So when we encounter a practice that asks us to do less, to simply be present with whatever arises, our entire system seems to revolt against it. Think about what happens when you first try to meditate. You close your eyes, focus on your breath, and within seconds your mind is off to the races. Suddenly you're mentally rehearsing tomorrow's presentation, replaying an awkward conversation from last week, planning your grocery list, and wondering if you remembered to lock the front door. It's as if the moment you ask your mind to be quiet, it decides to throw the loudest party possible. Wright describes this experience with such relatability because he's been there himself, struggling with the same mental chaos that visits all of us when we first sit down to do nothing. But here's where it gets really interesting. The very difficulty we experience in meditation isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's revealing something profound about how our minds actually work when we're not constantly distracting ourselves with activity. Wright draws on evolutionary psychology to help us understand why our brains seem so resistant to stillness. Our ancestors needed minds that were constantly scanning for threats, opportunities, and problems to solve. A mind that could just sit peacefully might have been a mind that missed the rustling in the bushes that signaled danger. Now think about this for a moment. We've inherited these incredibly active, problem-solving minds, but we're living in a world where most of our daily challenges don't require the same kind of hypervigilance that kept our ancestors alive. Yet our brains haven't gotten the memo. They're still running the same software, constantly generating thoughts, worries, plans, and reactions, even when we desperately want them to just take a break. Wright shares stories from his own meditation retreats that perfectly capture this internal struggle. He describes sitting in meditation halls, surrounded by people who appear to be peacefully absorbed in their practice, while his own mind feels like a tornado of thoughts and sensations. There's something both humbling and reassuring about his honesty here. This isn't a book written by someone who achieved instant enlightenment, but by someone who wrestled with the same challenges that make meditation feel impossible for so many of us. One of the most striking insights Wright offers is about the relationship between effort and surrender in meditation. We're taught to make effort to focus on our breath or maintain awareness, but we're also told to let go and not fight with our thoughts. It's like being asked to hold something firmly while simultaneously releasing your grip. This apparent contradiction drives many people away from meditation, convinced they're doing something wrong. But what if the confusion itself is the point? What if meditation is designed to show us the limitations of our usual approach to problems? In most areas of life, when something isn't working, we try harder. We push through, we strategize, we force solutions. Meditation asks us to try a completely different approach. Instead of conquering our wandering minds, we learn to observe them. Instead of eliminating thoughts, we practice changing our relationship to them. Wright uses a beautiful analogy here, comparing our thoughts to clouds passing through the sky of our consciousness. We don't try to stop the clouds or judge them for appearing. We simply notice them, watch them form and dissolve, and return our attention to the vast sky that contains them all. This shift from doing to being, from controlling to observing, represents a fundamental challenge to how most of us have learned to navigate the world. The real paradox isn't just that sitting still is hard, it's that in learning to do nothing skillfully, we actually discover something incredibly active and alive. We begin to see the constant stream of mental activity that usually runs beneath our awareness. We start to notice patterns in our thinking, habits of mind that have been shaping our experience without our conscious knowledge. This awareness becomes the foundation for everything else Buddhism has to offer, which is why Wright sees meditation not as a relaxation technique, but as a tool for investigating the very nature of our minds and our suffering. So we've been exploring how Buddhism offers us this radical new lens for understanding our minds, and now we're about to dive into something that might completely change how you think about your emotions. Grab your coffee a little tighter, because this next insight is going to shake up everything you thought you knew about feelings. Picture this. You're scrolling through social media and you see a post from an old friend who just got promoted to your dream job. Suddenly, there's this hot surge of jealousy coursing through your body. Your chest tightens, your jaw clenches, and there's this bitter taste in your mouth. In that moment, the jealousy feels absolutely real, doesn't it? It feels like truth. It's telling you something important about the world, about fairness, about what you deserve. But here's where Buddhism drops a bombshell that modern psychology is finally catching up to. That feeling isn't telling you the truth about reality. It's running an ancient program. Robert Wright takes us on this fascinating journey to understand what emotions actually are, and it's nothing like what we've been taught to believe. We've been conditioned to think that our feelings are these pure, authentic expressions of our inner truth. We say things like, "Trust your gut," and "Follow your heart," as if our emotions are infallible compasses pointing toward what's real and right. But Buddhism has been saying for over 2,000 years what evolutionary psychology is now confirming. Emotions aren't facts about the world. They're evolutionary software programs running in the background of our minds. Think about it this way. Imagine you're walking through a forest and you hear a rustling in the bushes. Instantly, fear floods your system. Your heart rate spikes, adrenaline surges, and every muscle in your body prepares for fight or flight. Now, is that fear telling you something true about reality? Well, maybe. There could be a dangerous predator in those bushes. But there could also be a harmless rabbit, or just the wind. The fear isn't responding to what's actually there. It's responding to the possibility of danger, because our ancestors who felt fear at every rustling sound were the ones who survived long enough to pass on their genes. This is the brilliant insight that Wright unpacks for us. Our emotions evolved not to give us accurate information about the world, but to motivate behaviors that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. That surge of anger when someone cuts you off in traffic, that's not your inner wisdom telling you something profound about justice and respect. That's an ancient program designed for a world where being disrespected by a stranger might actually threaten your status in a small tribal group, which could mean the difference between life and death. Now, here's where this gets really interesting for our daily lives. Wright shares this compelling example about romantic jealousy. When your partner talks enthusiastically about a coworker and you feel that familiar pang of jealousy, what's really happening? The feeling seems to be telling you something important about your relationship, about threat and betrayal and love. But from an evolutionary perspective, jealousy is just a program designed to guard against losing a mate, because in our ancestral environment, losing a partner could mean losing crucial resources and protection for raising offspring. The feeling of jealousy isn't giving you accurate information about whether your partner is actually cheating or even thinking about it. It's just running its ancient subroutine. Potential mate competition detected. Initiate mate guarding behaviors. The emotion feels so real, so true, so justified, but it's operating on outdated software in a modern world where the actual threats are completely different. This is where Buddhist meditation becomes revolutionary. When you sit quietly and observe your emotions without immediately believing them or acting on them, you start to see them for what they really are: temporary mental events, not permanent truths. You begin to notice how they arise, peak, and fade away like waves in the ocean. You start to see the gap between the feeling and the story your mind creates about what that feeling means. Wright describes this beautiful moment of recognition that many meditators experience. You're sitting there, maybe feeling frustrated about something, and suddenly you realize you're not actually frustrated. There's a sensation in your body, there's a mental formation happening, but you, the observer, are separate from it. The frustration is just weather passing through the sky of your consciousness. This doesn't mean emotions are bad or that we should try to eliminate them. They're incredibly useful. Fear keeps us safe, love bonds us to others, anger motivates us to fight injustice. But recognizing that emotions are evolutionary programs rather than divine truths gives us incredible freedom. We can experience them, learn from them, and choose how to respond rather than being automatically driven by them. As we move deeper into Wright's exploration, we'll discover how this simple shift in understanding can transform not just how we relate to our own emotions, but how we navigate relationships, make decisions, and find genuine peace in a world that's constantly triggering our ancient alarm systems. Picture this. You're scrolling through Instagram, And there's another meditation influencer promising that 10 minutes of mindfulness will transform your life into a state of perpetual bliss. The comments are filled with people sharing their transcendent experiences, their moments of pure ecstasy, their spiritual highs. And maybe you've tried meditation yourself, expecting to float away on clouds of serenity, only to find yourself sitting there with an itchy back, a wandering mind, and the distinct feeling that you're doing something wrong. Well, here's the thing that might surprise you: you're not doing anything wrong at all. In fact, you might be closer to the real point of meditation than those bliss seekers realize. Robert Wright tackles this misconception head-on, in what might be one of the most important sections of his entire book. He's essentially saying, hold up, everyone, we've got this backwards. The goal of meditation isn't to feel good, it's to see clearly. And there's a profound difference between these two objectives that could completely change how you approach not just meditation, but your entire understanding of what it means to be human. Now think about this for a moment. We live in a culture absolutely obsessed with feeling good. We chase dopamine hits like digital drug addicts, constantly seeking the next high, the next rush of pleasure or excitement. So naturally, when we turn to meditation, we bring that same mindset with us. We want the spiritual equivalent of a runner's high, that mythical state where all our problems dissolve and we're bathed in golden light. But Wright argues that this is exactly the trap that keeps us stuck in the very patterns meditation is designed to help us escape. Here's where it gets really interesting. Wright draws on both ancient Buddhist wisdom and cutting-edge neuroscience to explain what's actually happening when we meditate effectively. The Buddha himself warned against getting attached to the pleasant states that can arise during meditation. These blissful experiences, these moments of ecstasy, they're not the destination, they're just weather patterns in the mind. They come and go, and if we start chasing them, we're right back where we started. Craving, grasping, suffering. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to clean a dirty window so you can see outside clearly. The goal isn't to make the cleaning process feel amazing, it's to remove the grime so you can see what's actually there. Sometimes cleaning is pleasant, sometimes it's tedious, sometimes it reveals things you'd rather not see. But the clarity, that's what matters. That's what transforms everything. Wright shares a particularly compelling example from his own meditation practice. He describes sitting in retreat, experiencing what many would consider a profound spiritual breakthrough, waves of bliss, a sense of unity with the universe, the whole 9 yards. But his teacher's response was essentially, "That's nice. Now let it go and keep observing." This wasn't cruel indifference. It was pointing toward something much more valuable than temporary good feelings. The real magic happens when we start seeing through the illusions that normally govern our lives. We begin to recognize how our minds constantly create stories about ourselves and our experiences, how we're always dividing the world into me and not me, how we're perpetually caught up in mental movies of our own creation. This seeing isn't always pleasant, in fact. It can be quite uncomfortable to realize how much of what we consider reality is actually just mental construction. But here's where modern psychology backs up ancient wisdom in fascinating ways. When we stop chasing good feelings and start simply observing what's actually happening in our minds, we develop what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to step back and watch our own thinking processes. This isn't just spiritually beneficial. It's clinically proven to reduce anxiety, depression, and a whole host of other mental health issues. Wright makes another crucial point that resonates deeply in our current moment. In a world where we're constantly bombarded with stimulation, where our attention is being hijacked by algorithms designed to keep us scrolling, the ability to see clearly becomes almost revolutionary. When you can observe your mind's reactions to that inflammatory social media post without getting swept away by anger, when you can notice the urge to buy something without automatically reaching for your wallet, when you can feel anxiety arising without believing every catastrophic thought it brings, that's real freedom. The beautiful paradox Wright illuminates is this. When we stop trying so hard to feel good, we often end up feeling much better. Not because we're chasing bliss, but because we're no longer at the mercy of every emotional wave that crashes over us. We develop what you might call emotional surfing skills, the ability to ride the waves rather than being tumbled by them. This shift from feeling good to seeing clearly isn't just about meditation. It's about approaching life with a fundamentally different orientation, one that values truth over comfort, awareness over pleasure, and genuine freedom over temporary escape. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, watching people walk by, and suddenly you have this unsettling thought. What if the person you think you are doesn't actually exist? Not in some dramatic, existential crisis way, but in a much more fundamental sense. What if the very notion of a unified, continuous self is nothing more than an elaborate illusion your brain has been playing on you your entire life? This isn't some philosophical parlor trick we're talking about here. Robert Wright takes us on a fascinating journey where ancient Buddhist wisdom meets cutting-edge neuroscience, and the results are nothing short of mind-bending. For over 2,000 years, Buddhism has insisted that what we call the self is an illusion, a persistent, convincing mirage that causes us endless suffering. And now modern brain science is essentially saying, you know what? Those ancient monks were onto something pretty profound. Now think about this for a moment. When you wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, there's this immediate sense of recognition. That's me. That's who I've always been. You feel like there's this continuous thread running through your entire life, connecting the 5-year-old you to the teenager you to the adult you are today. But here's where things get interesting. Neuroscientists have been peering into our brains, and what they're finding suggests that this feeling of being a unified, continuous self might be one of the most sophisticated magic tricks our minds perform. Wright introduces us to some remarkable research that shows how our brains are actually more like a collection of different modules, each with its own agenda, rather than one unified command center with a CEO self calling all the shots. Think of it like this. Imagine your mind as a bustling office building, but instead of having one boss making all the decisions, you have dozens of different departments, each trying to influence what happens next. Sometimes the marketing department takes charge, sometimes it's accounting, sometimes it's security. But there's this persistent illusion that there's one executive in the corner office orchestrating everything. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from studies of people who have had their corpus callosum, the bridge connecting the brain's 2 hemispheres, severed. These split-brain patients reveal something extraordinary about how our sense of self operates. When researchers show different images to each hemisphere, something remarkable happens. The left brain, which houses our language centers, literally makes up stories to explain actions initiated by the right brain, even when it has no idea what's actually going on. It's like having a press secretary who's completely out of the loop, but still confidently explains every decision to the media. But here's what makes this so relevant to our daily lives. We all have this inner narrator, this voice in our head that's constantly telling us the story of who we are and why we do what we do. I'm the kind of person who always helps others. I chose this career because I'm passionate about making a difference. I got angry because they disrespected me. But what if this narrator is more like that split-brain patient's left hemisphere, confidently weaving together a coherent story, even when it doesn't really know what's driving our behavior? Wright shares a powerful example from his own meditation practice. During one session, he found himself getting incredibly frustrated with the sounds of construction outside. His immediate reaction was classic self-talk. I'm annoyed because this noise is interrupting my peaceful meditation. But as he looked more closely at what was actually happening in his mind, he realized something fascinating. The annoyance wasn't coming from some central self that was making a rational decision to be irritated. Instead, it was more like different mental processes firing off. The hearing process registering sound, the expectation process noting a deviation from what was planned, the emotional process generating irritation. His sense of being an annoyed self was actually his brain's after-the-fact story about these various processes. This insight has profound implications for how we understand our emotional lives. When you're stuck in traffic and feel your blood pressure rising, is there really a self that's choosing to be angry? Or is anger just arising from various mental processes, while your brain's narrator creates the story of "I'm angry because these idiots don't know how to drive"? The Buddhist perspective, now supported by neuroscience, suggests it's much more the latter. Now you might be thinking, okay, but if there's no self, then who's making decisions? Who's responsible for my actions? This is where Wright's exploration becomes particularly nuanced. He's not suggesting we become passive observers of our lives or that moral responsibility disappears. Instead, he's pointing toward a more accurate understanding of how our minds actually work, one that can lead to greater freedom and less suffering. As we dive deeper into this exploration, we'll discover how understanding the illusory nature of the self isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a practical path toward a more peaceful, compassionate way of being in the world. Picture this: you're sitting in a boardroom of a major corporation and someone asks to speak with the CEO. You'd expect to be directed to a corner office on the top floor, right? Well, here's the thing that might blow your mind over your morning coffee. When neuroscientists went looking for the CEO of your brain, they discovered something absolutely fascinating. There's no corner office. There's no executive suite. In fact, there's no CEO at all. Robert Wright takes us on this incredible journey into what he calls the "your CEO is MIA" phenomenon. And honestly, it's one of those insights that changes how you see yourself forever. Think about it for a moment. When you make a decision, when you choose chocolate over vanilla, when you decide to hit the snooze button one more time, who exactly is making that choice? Your gut reaction might be, well, I am, obviously. But Wright shows us that this "I" we're so sure about is more like a committee of voices than a single executive making the calls. Now, this isn't just some abstract philosophical musing. Modern neuroscience has literally looked inside our heads with brain scans and decades of research, and what they've found is revolutionary. Instead of finding one central command center calling the shots, they've discovered what's more like a bustling marketplace of different brain modules, each with their own agenda, all competing for influence. It's like having a smartphone where different apps are constantly running in the background, each trying to grab your attention and resources. Here's where it gets really interesting, and where Buddhism's ancient wisdom suddenly feels incredibly modern. 2,500 years ago, Buddhist thinkers were already onto this. They weren't talking about brain modules and neural networks, obviously, but they understood something profound about the nature of the self. They recognized that what we call me, or I, isn't this solid, unchanging entity sitting behind our eyes like some kind of mental driver. Instead, it's more like a river constantly flowing, made up of countless drops of water, never quite the same from moment to moment. Wright brings this home with examples we can all relate to. Think about the last time you were on a diet and found yourself standing in front of the refrigerator at midnight. Who decided to walk to the kitchen? Who's arguing for just one small piece of cake? Who's feeling guilty about it? It's like there's a whole cast of characters in there: the health-conscious you, the pleasure-seeking you, the guilty you, the rationalizing you. But here's the kicker: there's no director orchestrating this whole production. This has profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our struggles. When Wright explores this through a Buddhist lens, he's not asking us to accept this on faith. He's showing us how modern science backs up these ancient insights. The Buddha talked about the 5 aggregates that make up what we mistakenly think of as a solid self. Today's neuroscientists might use different language, but they're describing something remarkably similar: consciousness as an emergent property of multiple, competing processes rather than the product of a single, unified decision maker. Now you might be wondering, if there's no CEO in my head, then who's responsible for my actions? This is where Wright's exploration gets beautifully practical. Understanding that there's no central self doesn't mean we're off the hook for our choices, quite the opposite. It means we can start to observe these different voices and tendencies with a kind of gentle curiosity instead of harsh judgment. When you catch yourself scrolling social media when you meant to be working, instead of beating yourself up, you can think, there's that part of me that seeks distraction when things get challenging. This insight opens up incredible possibilities for change and growth. If you're not a fixed entity but more like a dynamic process, then transformation becomes not just possible but inevitable. Every moment offers the opportunity to notice which voices are currently running the show and to consciously choose which ones to listen to. It's like being the conductor of an orchestra where you can't control every instrument, but you can influence which sections get to play the melody. The beauty of Wright's approach is how he makes this feel empowering rather than unsettling. Yes, it might be a bit disorienting to realize there's no little person inside your head making all the decisions, but it's also incredibly liberating. It means you're not stuck with who you think you are. It means that nagging voice of self-criticism is just one voice among many, not the ultimate truth about you. As we move deeper into Wright's exploration of Buddhist psychology and modern neuroscience, this foundational understanding of the missing CEO becomes the key that unlocks so many other insights about suffering, happiness, and the possibility of genuine transformation. The next time you find yourself in conflict, whether it's about what to eat, how to respond to a difficult email, or any of life's countless small decisions, remember that you're witnessing the beautiful, chaotic democracy of the mind in action. Picture this: you're sitting at your computer determined to finish an important project. You've got your coffee, your notes are organized, and you're ready to focus. But then a notification pops up on your phone. Just a quick check, you tell yourself. 3 hours later, you're deep in a rabbit hole of social media posts, online shopping, and random articles about whether aliens built the pyramids. Sound familiar? What just happened to you isn't a failure of willpower or character. According to Robert Wright's fascinating exploration in Why Buddhism Is True, you've just witnessed your mental modules in action. And here's the thing that might surprise you. There's no unified you sitting at the controls of your mind, making rational decisions. Instead, your consciousness is more like a bustling committee room where different mental programs are constantly competing for control. Wright draws on evolutionary psychology to paint a picture of the mind that's radically different from what most of us assume. We like to think of ourselves as having a central self, a CEO of consciousness, if you will, who weighs options carefully and makes thoughtful decisions. But the reality is far messier and, frankly, far more interesting. Your mind is actually a collection of specialized mental modules, each designed by evolution to handle specific challenges our ancestors faced on the African savanna thousands of years ago. Think about it this way. Imagine your brain as a smartphone with dozens of apps running simultaneously. There's the Detect Potential Threats app, constantly scanning for danger. The Seek Social Status app, monitoring how others perceive you. The Find Food app, always alert to anything that might be tasty. The Mate Selection app, evaluating potential romantic partners. Each of these mental modules has its own agenda, its own priorities, and its own way of interpreting the world around you. Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. These modules don't always play nicely together. In fact, they're often in direct conflict. Wright shares the example of how your Be Cautious module might be screaming at you not to give that important presentation because it could damage your reputation, while your Seek Achievement module is pushing you to take the risk because success could elevate your status. The module that wins this internal battle determines your behavior in that moment. But wait, you might be thinking, Surely I have some control over this process. This is where Wright's insights become both humbling and liberating. The sense of being in control, of having a unified self making decisions, is largely an illusion created by what he calls the press secretary function of your consciousness. Just like a political press secretary spins events to create a coherent narrative, your mind constantly creates stories to explain your behavior after the fact, making it seem like there was always a rational plan behind your actions. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. You're at a party, and someone makes a comment that triggers your anger. In that moment, your defend reputation module takes control, and you respond with a sharp retort. Later, you might tell yourself and others that you decided to put that person in their place, creating a narrative of intentional action. But the reality is that a mental module hijacked your behavior, and your conscious mind is just the storyteller trying to make sense of what happened. This modular view of the mind explains so many puzzles of human behavior. Why do we procrastinate even when we know it's harmful? Because the avoid immediate discomfort module is overpowering the long-term planning module. Why do we eat that extra slice of cake despite being on a diet? The consume high-calorie foods module, designed for an environment of scarcity, is still running its ancient programming in our modern world of abundance. Wright argues that understanding this modular nature of mind is crucial for several reasons. First, it helps us develop compassion for ourselves and others. When someone behaves in ways that seem irrational or self-destructive, they're not necessarily weak or flawed. They're just experiencing the natural result of competing mental programs. Second, this understanding points toward practical strategies for change. Instead of trying to exert willpower over our entire mind, we can learn to recognize which modules are active and find skillful ways to work with them. This is where Buddhism's ancient insights prove remarkably prescient. Long before evolutionary psychology existed, Buddhist teachings describe the mind as lacking a fixed, permanent self. The practice of mindfulness, Wright suggests, allows us to step back and observe these mental modules in action, rather than being completely identified with whichever one happens to be running the show at any given moment. As we'll explore further, this modular understanding of mind isn't just an interesting intellectual exercise. It's a practical framework for understanding why we suffer, why we make the choices we do, and how contemplative practices like meditation might offer a path toward greater freedom and clarity. The question isn't whether you have mental modules competing for control. The question is whether you'll remain unconscious of this process or learn to work with it skillfully. You know how we started this journey together exploring whether Buddhism might actually be onto something scientifically? Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into perhaps the most mind-bending insight of all. And I mean that quite literally. We're talking about your mind, and who's really running the show up there. Spoiler alert, it might not be who you think it is. Picture this scene that probably happened to you just this morning. You're lying in bed, and suddenly a thought pops into your head. Maybe it's worry about that meeting today, or remembering you forgot to call your mom, or even just wondering what you're going to have for breakfast. Now here's the million-dollar question. Did you decide to think that thought? Did you consciously choose to have that worry materialize in your mind at that exact moment? Of course not. The thought just appeared, like an uninvited guest walking through your mental front door. This is where Wright takes us on a fascinating journey into what might be the most unsettling truth about human consciousness. He's building on insights that Buddhist monks figured out over 2,000 years ago, but now we have modern neuroscience backing up their observations. And what they discovered is pretty wild. Thoughts think themselves. Think about the voice in your head right now. Yes, that running commentary that's probably analyzing what I'm saying or wondering where this is all leading. That voice feels like it's you, doesn't it? It feels like the central command center of your being, the CEO of your mental corporation. But here's what's actually happening, according to both ancient Buddhist psychology and cutting-edge brain research. That voice is more like a radio that's constantly tuned into different stations, and you're not the DJ. Wright shares this incredible insight from meditation practitioners who, after spending thousands of hours observing their own minds, report the same strange phenomenon. When you really pay attention, and I mean really pay attention, to how thoughts arise, you start to notice something deeply weird. Thoughts don't emerge from some central you that's deciding what to think next. They just bubble up from nowhere, like champagne bubbles rising to the surface of a glass. Let me paint you a picture that might make this more concrete. You know how sometimes you're trying to remember someone's name, and you're searching, and then suddenly, bam! The name just appears. You didn't manufacture that memory through conscious effort. It emerged from some mysterious process happening beneath the surface of your awareness. Well, according to Wright, that's actually how all thoughts work. Every single one of them. This connects to something neuroscientists call the interpreter, a function of the brain that's constantly creating stories to explain what's happening. But here's the kicker. The interpreter isn't actually in charge of what's happening. It's more like a sports commentator who's really good at making up explanations for plays after they've already happened. Your brain makes a decision, and then the interpreter spins a story about how you made that decision, complete with logical reasons and rational explanations. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, this sounds pretty depressing. Are you telling me I'm not in control of anything? Well, not exactly. Wright isn't suggesting we're just helpless passengers in our own lives, but he is pointing out something that can be incredibly liberating once you really get it. The thoughts that cause you suffering, the anxious ruminations, the angry internal rants, the harsh self-criticism, those aren't really you either. Think about road rage for a moment. Have you ever been driving along perfectly calm, when suddenly someone cuts you off and wham, this whole narrative of anger and indignation just takes over your mind? Where did that come from? Did you sit down and consciously decide to construct an elaborate internal monologue about what an inconsiderate jerk that other driver is? Of course not. The thoughts just appeared, fully formed, like they'd been waiting in the wings for their cue. This is where the Buddhist insight becomes practically revolutionary. If thoughts think themselves, then maybe you don't have to take them so personally. Maybe that anxious voice warning you about everything that could go wrong isn't the wise, careful part of you looking out for your best interests. Maybe it's just another uninvited mental guest that showed up and started talking. The meditation masters discovered something remarkable. When you learn to observe thoughts without immediately identifying with them, something shifts. It's like the difference between being caught in a rainstorm and watching rain fall from inside a warm, dry house. The rain is still there, but your relationship to it is completely different. And this brings us to our next exploration, where we'll discover how this insight about the nature of thoughts connects to something even more fundamental about the self you think you are. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, scrolling through your phone when you suddenly remember that important project deadline looming tomorrow. You tell yourself, okay, I'm going to put this phone down right now and focus. But somehow, 20 minutes later, you find yourself deep in a rabbit hole of social media videos, wondering how on earth you got there. Sound familiar? Well, grab your coffee a little tighter, because what Robert Wright reveals in this section of Why Buddhism Is True might just shatter everything you thought you knew about self-control. Wright opens this fascinating exploration with a confession that hits close to home for most of us. He describes his own struggles with meditation, sitting there trying to focus on his breath while his mind wanders to grocery lists, work deadlines, and that embarrassing thing he said 3 weeks ago. Here's a guy who intellectually understands Buddhism, who's written extensively about it, and yet he still finds himself battling the same mental chaos we all experience. It's both humbling and oddly comforting, isn't it? Now, think about this for a moment. We live in a culture absolutely obsessed with willpower. Walk into any bookstore and you'll find shelves groaning under the weight of self-help books promising to teach you how to master your impulses, control your thoughts, and discipline your way to success. We treat willpower like a muscle that just needs to be strengthened through sheer determination. But what if this entire approach is fundamentally flawed? What if the very idea that there's some central, you, pulling the levers of control is nothing more than a convincing illusion? Wright dives deep into what Buddhist psychology has been saying for over 2,000 years, and what modern neuroscience is now confirming. There isn't really a CEO in your brain making executive decisions. Instead, think of your mind more like a bustling marketplace, with different desires, impulses, and thoughts all competing for attention and influence. Sometimes the voice saying, "Eat that donut," wins out over the voice saying, "Stick to your diet." Other times, the impulse to check your phone overpowers your intention to focus on work. But here's the kicker. There's no single you making these choices in the way we typically imagine. This insight becomes even more profound when Wright explores the Buddhist concept of not-self. Now, before you worry that this is getting too esoteric, stay with me because this has incredibly practical implications for how we approach everything from addiction to procrastination to relationship conflicts. The Buddhist teaching suggests that what we call self is really just a collection of ever-changing mental and physical processes. There's no fixed, unchanging essence that constitutes who you are. Consider how this plays out in real life. Have you ever noticed how different you feel in different situations? The you at a job interview feels completely different from the you hanging out with your best friend, which feels different from the you stuck in traffic. Buddhist psychology would say that's because there isn't one solid you. There are just different patterns of thoughts, emotions, and reactions arising based on conditions. Wright illustrates this with a brilliant analogy. Imagine your sense of self is like a movie. When you're watching a film, you experience it as one continuous story, but it's actually made up of thousands of individual frames flickering so quickly that your brain creates the illusion of seamless motion. Similarly, your sense of being a consistent self is really just consciousness rapidly processing countless momentary experiences, thoughts, and sensations. So what does this mean for self-control? Well, if there's no central commander issuing orders, then trying to white-knuckle your way through temptation is like trying to direct a symphony by shouting at the musicians. It might work occasionally, but it's exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. Instead, Buddhist practice offers a different approach: mindful awareness. Rather than fighting against unwanted thoughts and impulses, mindfulness teaches us to observe them with a kind of friendly curiosity. When that urge to check social media arises during work, instead of berating yourself or trying to suppress it, you simply notice it. Oh, there's that familiar urge again. You don't have to act on it, but you also don't have to wage war against it. This gentle awareness often allows the impulse to naturally fade away, like a wave that rises and then recedes. Wright shares compelling research showing that people who practice mindfulness meditation actually show increased activity in brain regions associated with attention and emotional regulation. But here's what's really interesting. They're not developing stronger willpower in the traditional sense. Instead, they're learning to step back and observe their mental processes rather than being completely identified with them. This shift in perspective can be absolutely revolutionary. When you realize that thoughts and impulses are just temporary visitors in the guest house of your mind, you're no longer at their mercy. You can acknowledge them without letting them drive the bus. And perhaps most importantly, you can stop beating yourself up when you inevitably fall short of your ideals, because you understand that the whole notion of perfect self-control was an illusion to begin with. As we move forward in our exploration of Buddhist psychology, keep this insight close to your heart. The path to greater peace and clarity doesn't lie in becoming a more disciplined version of your current self. It lies in understanding that the self you're trying to improve might not be quite what you think it is. You know how sometimes you're driving down a familiar highway and suddenly realize you've been on autopilot for the last 10 miles. Your mind was somewhere else entirely, yet somehow you navigated traffic, changed lanes, maybe even took your exit. It's as if consciousness itself has different layers, different modes of operation. Well, imagine taking that experience and diving much, much deeper. That's exactly what happens when meditators venture into what Buddhism calls the formless realms. Those advanced states of consciousness that sound almost mystical but reveal something profound about how our minds actually work. Robert Wright takes us on this fascinating journey into the deepest waters of meditation, where experienced practitioners encounter states so different from ordinary consciousness that they challenge everything we think we know about the nature of mind itself. Now, before you start thinking this is all esoteric mumbo-jumbo, consider this. These aren't just ancient curiosities. Modern neuroscience is actually backing up what contemplatives have been reporting for thousands of years, and the implications reach far beyond the meditation cushion. Picture this scene. Wright describes sitting with a meditation teacher who's explaining the jhanas. These are like the deep dive levels of meditative absorption that serious practitioners can access. Think of them as different floors in the skyscraper of consciousness. The first few floors might feel familiar. You know that peaceful, focused state you sometimes hit during meditation. That's just the ground level. But as you go higher, things get really interesting. In the deeper jhanas, meditators report entering states where the usual boundaries of self begin to dissolve. One practitioner Wright interviews describes it like this. Imagine you're a drop of water that suddenly realizes it's part of the ocean. The sense of being a separate, individual self doesn't just fade. It becomes almost laughably irrelevant. Now, here's where it gets fascinating from a scientific perspective. Brain scans of people in these states show dramatic changes in the default mode network. That's the brain system responsible for our sense of continuous selfhood, the narrator that keeps telling us, I'm thinking this, I'm feeling that, I'm experiencing this. But Wright doesn't just leave us floating in mystical waters. He brings this down to earth with a brilliant observation. These formless states aren't just spiritual achievements. They're like natural experiments in consciousness. They show us that what we normally consider our solid, unchanging self is actually more like a movie projected by our brains. When the projector gets turned off or tuned to a different frequency, we discover there was never really a solid us there in the first place. Think about this for a moment. How often do you catch yourself saying, I am angry instead of I'm experiencing anger? It seems like a small distinction, but these deep meditative states reveal it's actually enormous. The anger, the joy, the anxiety, they're all temporary weather patterns in the sky of consciousness, but we spend most of our lives thinking we are the weather instead of the sky itself. Wright shares a particularly striking example from his own meditation retreats. During one intensive session, he describes entering a state where thoughts still arose, but there was no sense of anyone thinking them. It was like watching clouds form and dissolve in an empty sky. No controller, no experiencer, just pure awareness itself. Now, this might sound terrifying. Who wants to lose their sense of self? But practitioners consistently report these states as profoundly peaceful and liberating. Here's where ancient wisdom meets cutting-edge psychology. These formless states are giving us a preview of what Buddhist philosophy has always claimed, that our suffering comes largely from our desperate clinging to a self that was never really there in the first place. It's like spending your whole life trying to catch your own shadow. The harder you chase it, the more frustrated you become, never realizing that the shadow is just an optical illusion created by your own body blocking the light. But perhaps the most practical insight from these advanced states is how they illuminate our everyday experience. You don't need to spend years in retreat to benefit from this understanding. Simply recognizing that your thoughts and emotions are temporary visitors rather than permanent residents can transform how you relate to difficult experiences. That crushing anxiety about your presentation tomorrow. It's weather, not climate. That surge of road rage when someone cuts you off. Just another cloud passing through the sky of awareness. Wright masterfully connects these profound states to our modern predicament of information overload and constant distraction. In a world where we're bombarded with stimuli designed to capture and monetize our attention, these ancient practices offer something revolutionary. The possibility of stepping back and recognizing the spacious awareness that exists beneath all the mental noise. As we prepare to explore how these insights translate into practical wisdom for daily life, we're left with a tantalizing question. If consciousness is this flexible, this open to transformation, what else might be possible when we stop taking our ordinary experience as the final word on reality? Picture this. You're walking through the forest and you see a snake coiled on the path ahead. Your heart races, adrenaline surges, and you jump back before you even consciously register what you're looking at. But here's the fascinating part. What if I told you that your brain might be completely wrong about what's actually there? What if that snake is just a curved stick, a shadow, or a piece of rope? And here's the even more mind-bending question. What if being wrong in this way actually kept our ancestors alive? This is where Robert Wright takes us on one of the most eye-opening journeys in Why Buddhism Is True, into the evolutionary case against reality itself. Now, before you think we're about to dive into some abstract philosophical rabbit hole, let me assure you this hits right at the heart of your daily experience. Every single day, your brain is serving up a version of reality that's been crafted not for truth, but for survival. Think about it this way. Natural selection doesn't care whether you see the world accurately. It only cares whether you survive long enough to pass on your genes. So if seeing a stick as a potentially dangerous snake keeps you alive, evolution says, perfect, let's wire the brain to err on the side of caution. The ancestor who occasionally jumped away from harmless sticks lived longer than the one who carefully examined every snake-like object to determine its true nature. Wright introduces us to the work of cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman, who puts this in stark terms that might make you question everything you think you know about perception. Hoffman argues that our senses are like a computer desktop. They show us useful icons, not the underlying reality of the computer's hardware. When you click on a blue rectangular icon labeled Document, you're not actually seeing the magnetic patterns on your hard drive or the electrical circuits processing information. The icon is a useful fiction that helps you navigate the system. Now, here's where this gets really interesting for our modern lives. Consider how this plays out in something as simple as your daily commute. You see that car cutting into your lane, and immediately your brain creates a story. That driver is an inconsiderate jerk who doesn't respect other people. But what if the evolutionary programming that helped your ancestors quickly categorize threats and allies is now creating unnecessary stress and conflict in your life? What if that driver is actually rushing to the hospital, or genuinely didn't see you, or is learning to drive in a new country? The Buddha, sitting under that Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago, somehow intuited what modern evolutionary psychology is now confirming through rigorous research. Our ordinary way of seeing the world is fundamentally distorted. But here's the crucial insight Wright brings to light. This isn't a design flaw, it's a feature. Our brains evolved to create useful illusions, not accurate perceptions. Let's make this even more personal. Have you ever noticed how a piece of chocolate cake can seem absolutely irresistible when you're hungry, but completely unappealing right after you've eaten a large meal? The cake hasn't changed, your brain's perception of it has. Evolution wired us to find high-calorie foods incredibly attractive when we need energy, because in our ancestral environment, such foods were rare and precious. But in a world of abundant processed foods, this same programming can lead us astray. Or consider how we perceive other people. Wright explains how our brains are constantly making snap judgments about others based on minimal information. their appearance, their voice, their group affiliations. These rapid categorizations helped our ancestors quickly identify potential allies, mates, and threats. But in our complex modern world, these same mental shortcuts can fuel prejudice, misunderstanding, and conflict. The profound implications of this extend far beyond individual psychology. Think about how this shows up in our political discourse, our social media interactions, our workplace dynamics. We're walking around with Stone Age brains trying to navigate a digital age world, and the illusions that once kept us alive are now often the very things that cause us suffering. But here's where Buddhist practice offers something remarkable, a way to see through these evolutionary illusions. Meditation, mindfulness, and the cultivation of wisdom aren't just ancient spiritual practices. They're sophisticated technologies for debugging the perceptual software that evolution installed in our minds. When you sit quietly and observe your thoughts without immediately believing them, you're essentially doing what Wright calls stepping outside the matrix of evolved perception. This sets up one of the most compelling aspects of Wright's argument, that Buddhism offers a scientifically grounded path toward seeing reality more clearly. As we'll explore further, the very illusions that evolution built into our minds are precisely what Buddhist practice is designed to help us recognize and transcend. Picture this. You're sitting with a friend who just got back from a meditation retreat, and they're glowing with this serene confidence, telling you they've had a profound awakening. Your first thought might be, okay, but what does that actually mean? And more importantly, did it actually change anything real about their life? This is exactly the kind of honest, slightly skeptical question that Robert Wright tackles head-on when he digs into what Buddhist enlightenment really is, and whether it lives up to all the hype. Now, think about this for a moment. We live in a world where enlightenment has become almost like a spiritual brand. Everyone from Silicon Valley executives to your yoga instructor talks about awakening experiences, mindful awareness, and transcendent insights. But Wright, with his characteristic blend of scientific rigor and genuine curiosity, wants to know, when the meditation cushion is put away and the retreat ends, what's actually different? The traditional Buddhist understanding of enlightenment, or what they call awakening, isn't some mystical state where you suddenly understand the meaning of life and float 3 inches off the ground. It's actually much more practical and, in some ways, more radical than that. At its core, enlightenment in Buddhism means seeing through what Wright calls the illusion of the self. This isn't about denying that you exist, but rather recognizing that the thing you think of as you, that constant narrator in your head, that sense of being a solid, unchanging entity moving through the world, is actually more like a collection of ever-changing processes than a fixed thing. Wright shares a fascinating story about his own meditation experiences that really brings this home. He describes sitting in meditation and suddenly realizing that what he normally thought of as his thoughts were just arising and passing away on their own, like clouds drifting across the sky. There wasn't really a him thinking them in the way he'd always assumed. It's like discovering that what you thought was a movie projector was actually just images appearing on a screen. The sense of being the operator, the one in control, starts to dissolve. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something Wright explores with his typical honesty about his own journey. Does this kind of insight actually make you a better person? Does it reduce suffering in any measurable way? The answer, it turns out, is both yes and no, and it's more complicated than most spiritual teachers want to admit. On one hand, people who have these awakening experiences often report a profound sense of relief. Think about how much energy you spend defending and maintaining your sense of self, worrying about how others perceive you, getting caught up in narratives about your past and future, feeling personally attacked when someone disagrees with you. When you start to see through the solidity of that self, a lot of that psychological friction just naturally diminishes. It's like realizing you've been carrying around a heavy backpack that you didn't even know you were wearing. Wright describes meeting meditation teachers and advanced practitioners who embody this kind of ease. They're not constantly reactive, not always taking things personally, not caught up in the endless mental commentary that exhausts most of us. There's something genuinely different about how they move through the world, something that suggests they've touched something real and transformative. But then there's the other side of the story, and this is where Wright's scientific background really shines through. He's not content to just accept the glowing testimonials. He wants to know, do enlightened people actually behave better? Are they kinder, more ethical, less prone to the petty jealousies and unconscious biases that plague the rest of us? And here, the evidence gets murky. The uncomfortable truth is that having profound meditative insights doesn't automatically make someone a saint. Wright points to examples of meditation teachers who have had genuine awakening experiences but still ended up in scandals, still struggled with power, money, and relationships in very human ways. It's like discovering that being a brilliant physicist doesn't necessarily make you a good parent or a reliable friend. This brings us to what might be the most important insight in this entire discussion. Enlightenment, as Wright sees it, isn't a destination you reach where all your problems disappear. It's more like developing a different relationship with your problems, your thoughts, and your emotional reactions. Instead of being completely identified with every passing mood and mental story, you start to have some space, some perspective. Think of it this way. If your mind is usually like being caught in a movie where you're completely absorbed in the drama, awakening is like remembering you're actually sitting in a theater. The movie is still playing, emotions are still arising, challenges still appear, but there's this fundamental shift in perspective that changes everything. You're no longer lost in the story in quite the same way. As we move forward in exploring Wright's journey through Buddhist practice and neuroscience, we'll discover how this ancient insight about the nature of self connects with cutting-edge brain research, and why understanding this might be more crucial now than ever before in our hyperconnected, identity-obsessed world. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, scrolling through your phone, when suddenly you realize you've been mindlessly checking the same 3 apps for the past 20 minutes. Your coffee's gone cold, you haven't actually absorbed any information, and that familiar knot of restless dissatisfaction sits in your chest. Now, what if I told you that this exact moment holds the key to understanding what Buddhists call liberation? Not some mystical, otherworldly experience, but something surprisingly practical and immediate. Robert Wright takes us on a fascinating journey into what he calls Nirvana in a nutshell. And here's the beautiful thing about his approach. He strips away all the exotic terminology and cultural baggage to show us that Buddhist liberation isn't about becoming a monk or sitting in lotus position for hours. It's about recognizing something that's happening in your mind right now, in this very moment, as you listen to these words. Think about the last time you really, truly wanted something. Maybe it was a promotion, a relationship, or even just the perfect avocado at the grocery store. Wright explains that our brains are essentially craving machines, constantly generating desires and then promising us that fulfilling them will bring lasting satisfaction. But here's the kicker. They never do. Not really. We get the thing we wanted, feel good for a moment, and then the mind immediately starts generating new cravings. It's like being on a treadmill that never stops, and we've been running on it so long we've forgotten what solid ground feels like. Now, here's where Buddhism gets really interesting for modern life. The Buddha's insight wasn't that we should stop wanting things entirely. That would be impossible and probably pretty miserable. Instead, he discovered something much more subtle and practical. He realized that our suffering doesn't come from not getting what we want. It comes from believing the stories our minds tell us about why we need these things to be happy. Wright shares a compelling example from his own meditation practice. He describes sitting in meditation, feeling anxious about an upcoming presentation, when suddenly he had what he calls a liberating moment. Instead of getting caught up in the anxiety, analyzing it, or trying to push it away, he simply observed it with what Buddhists call mindful awareness. And something remarkable happened. The anxiety was still there, but his relationship to it completely changed. It was like watching clouds pass through the sky instead of being caught in a storm. This is what liberation looks like in practice, and it's far more accessible than most people realize. It's not about achieving some permanent state of bliss. That's actually a common misconception that keeps people from engaging with these ideas. Real liberation is more like developing a new skill, similar to learning to ride a bike or play an instrument. At first, it takes conscious effort and practice, but gradually it becomes more natural. Consider how this applies to our relationship with technology and social media. We've all experienced that compulsive checking behavior, that sense of being pulled toward our devices even when we don't consciously decide to look at them. Buddhist practice offers us a way to observe these impulses without automatically acting on them. It's not about becoming a digital hermit. It's about developing what Wright calls cognitive freedom, the ability to see our mental habits clearly and choose how to respond. One of the most practical aspects of this approach is how it changes our relationship with difficult emotions. Instead of seeing anger, sadness, or anxiety as problems to be solved immediately, we can learn to observe them with curiosity and compassion. Wright describes this as developing emotional resilience, but it's really more like developing emotional intelligence on steroids. You begin to see that emotions are temporary visitors in your mind, not permanent residents, and certainly not accurate reporters of reality. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require you to adopt any particular beliefs or change your entire lifestyle. You can be a Buddhist practitioner while remaining completely secular, scientific, and rational. In fact, Wright argues that modern neuroscience actually supports many of the Buddha's insights about how our minds work and why we suffer. As we wrap up this exploration of practical liberation, think about this. What if the peace and contentment you've been seeking isn't something you need to acquire or achieve, but something you can access right now by simply changing how you relate to your own experience? What if liberation isn't about escaping from ordinary life, but about waking up more fully to the life you're already living? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're invitations to experiment with your own consciousness and discover what Buddhist wisdom might offer your very modern, very real, very human experience. Picture yourself sitting in a bustling coffee shop, surrounded by the familiar chaos of daily life. Conversations blend together, phones buzz with notifications, and your mind jumps from your morning meeting to tonight's dinner plans to that text you forgot to answer. Now imagine if I told you that beneath all this apparent randomness lies a hidden architecture of experience that most of us never notice. This is exactly what Robert Wright reveals when he explores how meditation acts like a magnifying glass for the mind, showing us patterns and structures that have been there all along, quietly shaping our every moment. Wright begins this fascinating section by acknowledging something we've all experienced but rarely examine closely. You know that feeling when you're driving a familiar route and suddenly realize you can't remember the last 10 minutes? Or when you're in the middle of an argument and wonder how you got so worked up about something that seemed trivial just moments before? These aren't random glitches in our mental operating system. They're glimpses of what Wright calls the unseen order of consciousness, the hidden currents that carry us through our days without our awareness. Think about this for a moment. Right now, as you listen to these words, your brain is performing an extraordinary feat of coordination. It's filtering out background noise, focusing on my voice, connecting new information to things you already know, and probably running a dozen other processes you're completely unaware of. The remarkable thing isn't that this happens, but that we're so rarely conscious of it happening. It's like living in a house for years, without realizing there's an entire basement level you've never explored. This is where Wright's exploration of meditation becomes particularly compelling. He describes how contemplative practice doesn't create some mystical altered state, but rather allows us to see the ordinary workings of our minds with unusual clarity. When seasoned meditators talk about observing their thoughts, they're not describing some esoteric spiritual experience. They're doing something surprisingly practical, like a scientist studying the behavior of cells under a microscope. Wright shares a vivid example that many of us can relate to. Imagine you're sitting quietly, trying to meditate, when suddenly you remember that embarrassing thing you said at last week's party. Instantly, your body tenses, your breathing changes, and a cascade of related memories begins flooding in. But here's where it gets interesting. With practice, you start to notice not just the embarrassing memory, but the entire sequence of events it triggers. You see how one thought leads to another, how emotions arise and shift, how your body responds before your conscious mind even realizes what's happening. Now, you might be wondering, what's the practical value of all this self-observation? Wright argues that this awareness reveals something profound about the nature of our everyday suffering. Most of our mental distress doesn't come from external events themselves, but from the elaborate stories we tell ourselves about those events. When your boss sends a terse email, the actual words might be neutral, but your mind immediately constructs a narrative. Maybe she's angry with you, maybe your job is in jeopardy, maybe you're not as competent as you thought. Before you know it, you're stressed about a story that might be completely fictional. The hidden structure Wright describes operates like an invisible assembly line in our minds. Raw sensory input comes in, gets processed through layers of interpretation, memory, and emotion, and emerges as our experienced reality. The problem is that we usually only notice the final product, not the manufacturing process. It's like eating a meal without knowing what ingredients went into it or how it was prepared. Here's where the metaphor becomes particularly powerful. Just as understanding nutrition helps us make better food choices, understanding the mechanics of our mental experience helps us relate to our thoughts and emotions more skillfully. When you recognize that your anxiety about tomorrow's presentation is actually a complex construction built from memories, projections, and bodily sensations, it becomes less solid, less overwhelming. You begin to see it as a process rather than a fact. Wright emphasizes that this isn't about becoming emotionally numb or detached from life. Instead, it's about developing what he calls metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own thinking while it's happening. This creates a kind of mental space, a pause between stimulus and response that allows for greater choice in how we react to life's inevitable challenges. As we move deeper into Wright's exploration of Buddhist psychology, we'll discover how these insights about the hidden structure of experience connect to larger questions about the nature of the self and our place in the world. But for now, consider this invitation to become a curious observer of your own mind, to notice the intricate dance of thoughts, emotions, and sensations that creates your moment-to-moment experience. The laboratory is always open, and the only equipment you need is your own attention. Welcome back to One Book, One Coffee, where we're diving deep into Robert Wright's fascinating exploration of Buddhism through the lens of modern psychology and evolutionary science. Pour yourself a fresh cup, because today we're venturing into some of the most profound territory in the entire book. The prison of the self and why letting go of our ego might actually be the secret to genuine happiness. Now think about this for a moment. When was the last time you were truly, completely happy, not just pleased or satisfied, but genuinely at peace? If you're like most of us, those moments are probably rare and fleeting. Wright argues this isn't an accident, it's actually by design, courtesy of our evolutionary programming. But here's where Buddhism offers something revolutionary, a way out of what Wright calls the prison of the self. Picture this scenario that Wright describes so vividly. You're walking through your day, and there's this constant narrator in your head, your inner voice commenting, judging, planning, worrying. I need to get that promotion. Why did she say that to me? I'm running late again. I look terrible in this outfit. This voice feels like the real you, doesn't it? The CEO of your consciousness, making executive decisions and maintaining your sense of identity. But what if I told you that this very sense of self, this feeling of being a separate, distinct individual navigating the world, might actually be the source of much of our suffering? Wright takes us on a journey through both ancient Buddhist wisdom and cutting-edge neuroscience to explore this radical idea. He explains how our brains are essentially storytelling machines, constantly weaving together our thoughts, feelings, and experiences into a coherent narrative about who we are. But here's the kicker: modern brain science is revealing that this sense of a unified, controlling self might be largely an illusion. Consider the famous split brain studies that Wright discusses. When the connection between the left and right hemispheres of the brain is severed, something fascinating happens. The left brain, which houses our language centers, continues to create explanations for actions initiated by the right brain, even when it has no actual knowledge of why those actions occurred. It's like having a press secretary in your head who's constantly making up plausible-sounding explanations for decisions they had nothing to do with. This suggests that our sense of being in control, of being the author of our actions, might be more of a post hoc story than reality. Now you might be thinking, okay, but if the self is an illusion, why does it feel so real? And why does it cause suffering? Wright explains this through the lens of evolutionary psychology. Our ancestors who had a strong sense of self, who were vigilant about their status, their resources, their survival, were more likely to pass on their genes. The problem is, this same psychological machinery that helped our ancestors survive on the African savanna is now running amok in our modern world. Think about social media for a moment. Every notification, every like, every comment triggers that ancient system designed to monitor our social status. We get a little hit of anxiety when someone doesn't respond to our message, or a boost of pride when our post gets attention. We're constantly defending and promoting this sense of self, this ego, even when it's making us miserable. It's like being trapped in a prison where we're simultaneously the prisoner and the guard. But here's where Buddhism offers something truly liberating. Through practices like meditation, we can begin to see through this illusion of the separate self. Wright describes his own experiences with intensive meditation retreats, where after days of sustained practice, the boundaries of the self begin to dissolve. He talks about moments where the distinction between observer and observed fades away, where there's awareness but no sense of someone doing the being aware. This isn't just mystical mumbo-jumbo, it's increasingly supported by neuroscience. Brain scans of experienced meditators show decreased activity in the default mode network, the brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and the sense of a separate self. When this network quiets down, people report feeling more connected, more at peace, less caught up in their own mental drama. Wright shares a particularly striking example from his own meditation practice. He describes watching thoughts and emotions arise and pass away, but instead of identifying with them, instead of thinking I'm angry or I'm anxious, there was simply the observation of anger or anxiety appearing in consciousness, like clouds passing through an empty sky. The suffering came not from the emotions themselves, but from the story of a self that was having these emotions, that needed to do something about them, that was somehow threatened by them. This points to what might be the most radical insight in the entire book, that genuine happiness might not come from getting what we want or becoming who we think we should be, but from loosening our grip on the very idea that there's a separate self that needs to get anything at all. It's a happiness that comes not from acquisition, but from release, not from building up the ego, but from seeing through it entirely. As we move forward in our exploration of Wright's insights, we'll discover how this understanding of the illusory self connects to everything else Buddhism teaches about the nature of suffering and the path to liberation. Robert Wright's Why Buddhism Is True weaves together ancient wisdom and modern psychology to reveal a profound truth. Much of our suffering stems from the very mental machinery that once helped our ancestors survive. The Buddha's insights about the illusory nature of the self, the impermanence of all things, and the possibility of liberation through mindfulness aren't just spiritual platitudes. They're accurate descriptions of how our minds actually work, validated by contemporary neuroscience and psychology. The book's central revelation is that our brains evolved not to make us happy, but to help us survive and reproduce. The constant wanting, the endless mental chatter, the way we cling to a sense of self that doesn't really exist, these aren't bugs in the system, they're features. But here's the liberating part. Once we understand this, we can begin to work with our minds rather than being enslaved by them. Here are the key takeaways that can transform how you navigate daily life. First, practice the not-self perspective regularly. When you feel overwhelmed by emotions or caught in mental loops, pause and ask, who is experiencing this? Look for the observer behind the thoughts. Start incredibly small, just a few seconds of this inquiry during routine moments like washing dishes or walking. This isn't about denying your experiences, but recognizing that you are not identical to every passing thought or feeling. Second, embrace impermanence as a friend, not an enemy. When something wonderful happens, savor it fully while remembering it won't last forever. When difficulties arise, remind yourself that this too shall pass. Be patient with yourself as you learn to hold things lightly. This wisdom develops gradually through practice, not through forcing. Third, cultivate mindful awareness throughout your day. You don't need to meditate for hours. Instead, bring conscious attention to ordinary moments. Notice when your mind creates stories about why someone cut you off in traffic or why your colleague seemed distant. These stories often say more about your mental conditioning than about reality. Fourth, question the voice of natural selection in your head, the one that insists you need more, better, different to be happy. When you feel that familiar restlessness or dissatisfaction, pause and recognize it as an ancient program running, not as truth about what you actually need. Finally, approach this work with compassion, not self-improvement fervor. The goal isn't to become a perfect Buddhist practitioner, but to see more clearly and suffer less. Every moment of awareness, however brief, is valuable progress on this path. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.